Joining us to consider where Africa is at in this year this Africa Day of celebration, we have joining us first on the line from his abode, I believe, in Kenya, Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba, PLO Lumumba, and we say good afternoon, good morning even to you, sir.
Yeah, good morning here in Nairobi, Kenya.
Oh, well, I'm glad we're in the same time zone, even if you're maybe about 3 hours ahead of us. And thanks very much, as always, for joining us on the Asaase Breakfast Show. So, in celebration of Africa Day, it is the theme of this year's celebrations being justice for Africans through reparations. A historical note to take for this year's 2025 Africa Day celebration. What for you is the lasting significance of the idea of reparations in the 21st century from an economic point of view?
First of all, let me start by saying that it rather say in commemoration rather than in celebration, because I'm speaking about the continent of Africa at a time when she is not at ease. But to be faithful to your question, the issue of reparation is one that has been alive for a long time. And what Africa has always demanded, not only of the colonizers, but the erstwhile enslavers, is that she be compensated to the extent that is calculable. But that in itself is not sufficient. Africans have always wanted an unequivocal acknowledgement by the enslavers and the colonizers that the atrocities and humiliation to which Africans were subjected ought to be acknowledged and ought to be compensated. So the demand that is now being made is to re-energize that call that has remained alive since the 19th century. And this year, therefore, I want to hear an Africa that makes it abundantly clear to the British, to the Portuguese, to the Germans, to the French, to the Italians, to the Dutch, to the Americans, and even to the Arabs, whom we don't mention as often as we should, that this is the time for reparation. That is what I want to hear during this year.
The suggestion is by some who are more focused on the idea of Africa achieving economic independence or real terms independence through trading between ourselves, is that the historical angle or the historical aspect to Africa's current situation is important. But what we should be looking at is perhaps how we dial up just business, the nuts and bolts stuff. From the point of view of what you said, not only the symbolic but the practical importance perhaps of reparations, can you point to other examples in the world where you feel the establishment of a regime of reparations has made the difference in that country's ability or region's ability to determine its own destiny?
My own view is that that question is without merit. Africa need not compare ourselves with others in order to justify or legitimize our compensation. The question that we should be asking is, were Africans enslaved? Were Africans colonized? Were African resources taken away from the continent? Initially, Africans taken away to the Caribbean, to the United States of America, and subjected to slave labor. Have our resources been used and abused? Once we answer those questions in the affirmative, it is idle and I think insensitive to ask where else has it succeeded. We are not asking for reparation with reference to others. We are saying there ought to be reparations, and we are not blind to the fact that Africa should pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We are alive to those realities. We are not saying that Africa is pressing the brakes and will only begin to do what she needs to do once we receive reparations. We are saying that that reparation or the compensation is a necessary acknowledgement. If you look at African initiatives right from 1963 to the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, to Africa Agenda 2063, and Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that is at the continental level. And at the regional level, you see what is happening in SADC, in ECOWAS, in East African Community, in the Maghreb, in Central Africa, and lately in the Sahel. We are conscious of the fact that we must continue to do what is necessary to catapult the continent into the orbit of political, economic, cultural, and technological development. So these are not issues that should be seen in isolation. They should be seen as complementary. And when we see them in that way, then in my view, our diagnosis will attract the right prescription.
I'm very glad you raised the question of what has been done at the regional bloc level to actually integrate African countries, because, of course, you're Kenyan in origin, although Africa, the whole of the African continent, is your home. Remarkable level of integration there, linguistically, culturally, even though there are very distinct cultures within the East African region, and remarkable progress in the ADC, with, of course, Kenya being the standout, the giant in the region, but Uganda fast stealing a march. What for you have been the signs of progress and the signs perhaps of difficulty to do with integration at the regional level?
The answer to your question must necessarily be nuanced. If you look at the East African region, which was the pioneer in integration, remember that we had the East African Community from 1967 and then 1977, it fell apart. During those 10 years, we had a common currency, a common examination system, common customs. We were integrated. Then, of course, it collapsed, courtesy of internal contradictions and external influence. It was revived again in 1999, and we have made to ourselves quite a number of promises. Those number of promises include political federation, customs union, and a common market, and ultimately a common currency. And during that period, the original countries, which were Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, admitted Rwanda and Burundi, and then South Sudan, and lately the Democratic Republic of Congo and Somalia. And the integration is struggling. But that is not to say that certain strides have not been made. The reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers have aided trade in certain areas. And people-to-people integration, which to me is the lifeblood of true integration, continues apace. And I think that certain lessons have now been learned in the East African Community, which may be borrowed by SADC and ECOWAS and even the Maghreb and Central Africa. But this is work in progress. And I believe it is work in progress because, as I've already indicated, there'll always be internal contradictions and issues of reliance on sovereignty as an aspect that immunizes individual member countries from scrutiny also becomes a problem. But that is a reminder to us that is never easy. If you look at the European Union, which now boasts to be better integrated, you and me have seen what has happened with Brexit. It means that sometimes there is toing and froing, even when we think that we have got it right. But the beauty of these initiatives is that it is informed by the realizations that stronger we will be if we are united, and weak we will be if we are disunited. And that, to me, is the saving grace.
Progress not being a linear procedure, perhaps there could be setbacks, as you say, the case of the European Union offering an example in point, even though the level of integration of European trade within European countries being in the level of just under 70%, compared to under 20% for African countries, and the level of intra-regional trade. Europe seeming to point the example, but Europe having had centuries of history to reach this point of integration, and considerably longer than the African project has been a real thing for most African countries to try to bring about economic integration. You spoke, PLO Lumumba, about the lessons perhaps that could be learned from other regional blocs, from the experience of the EADC. What do you see those prime lessons as being?
A number of lessons, I think, can be drawn from other regional bodies. The Europeans, ironically, started with the steel in 1950s and went through difficulties, and then very quickly they were able to realize that trade, and therefore the removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers and the movement of peoples, is critical. They were also able to realize that having a common currency is a useful thing. They were also able to recognize that infrastructure is critical. And I think there are lessons to be learned there, that our tax regimes ought to be better integrated, that our monetary policies ought to be better integrated, that we should ease the movement of peoples, so that we should remove the visa regimes to allow people to move across the continent and across the regions a lot more freely. I think there is something positive to be learned from there. The NAFTA in Northern America continues to struggle because of the hegemonic approach that the United States of America has taken over the years. But even as between the United States of America and Canada, there are certain lessons to be learned. Of course, with the new administration in the United States of America is so schizophrenic, if you may, that one must also learn. Even when we think that is positive, it is important to recognize that policy consistency and policy predictability is significant if you want to have a successful integration. CARICOM, the Caribbean countries, have also demonstrated to us that if you are able to align policies, then it becomes very important in the long run and for sustainability of this integration process. One of the things that is important to identify is that in East Africa, in the year 2004, the heads of states and governments recognized, or thought they recognized, that fast-tracking political federation would add impetus to the process of integration. There was a report which was delivered in 2004 to expedite political integration, but it was never implemented, which suggests to me that many countries are very slow to integrate politically, and that what countries want to do is initially to have a customs union, a common market, and ultimately a political federation with all the dividends that come with it. So in a nutshell, something to be learned from Europe about people movement, about removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers, about a common currency, about having a consistent and coherent foreign policy. These are things which we ought to embrace in Africa. If we can't do it from the standpoint of the African Union, then let us start by doing it from the regional economic communities which are known to us, but which, if you permit me, I'll repeat ad nauseum: ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community, the Maghreb, Central Africa, and other like IGAD and COMESA. And if we move in that direction, understanding as we do and must that there are certain specificities unique to Africa, then I think will energize the process of integration.
You spoke also earlier on, PLO Lumumba, about Africa being at a rather troubled moment. We're past the peak of the era of coups, the 1970s, but perhaps the tendency of events seems to be drifting back slightly in that direction. One area noted for its coups, of course, the Alliance of Sahelian States, the AES, but much pointed to by Africanists and leftists as a model of self-sufficiency or realizing ambitions of self-sufficiency and pulling oneself away from the colonial past. For you, how do you see developments, shifts in the geopolitical balance, such as the formation of this new alliance of Sahelian states, as affecting the greater project of African integration?
Let me say, almost by way of repetition, that when Kwame Nkrumah wrote his book in 1965, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, he was right. He was able to recognize very early on that the colonizers would still want to retain control in their former colonies. And it is in that context that I ordinarily see organizations such as the Commonwealth, which is controlled from London. That is how I see La Francophonie, which is controlled from Paris, the organization of Portuguese-speaking countries. And when you look at them as neo-colonial institutions whose raison d'etre is to ensure that they control their erstwhile colonies, then you can understand that some of the conflicts you see in Africa are actually engineered and manufactured by foreign bodies, of course, working with the comprador bourgeoisie in the mother countries. And the electoral processes that we see in Africa are now so susceptible to manipulation that they are capable of producing individuals into positions of leadership in a manner that undermines the countries. The coups that you therefore see in Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, and their accompanying popularity is a statement by the population that we have recognized that the ballot will not produce the leadership that we desire. And for that reason, we are saying that we need extraordinary steps so that when they are called coup d'etats, I call them creeping revolutions. And this is going to happen a lot more as countries recognize that you cannot change certain leaders through the ballot. And it is not lost on me that as we have this conversation, you see what is happening in Sudan, what is happening in parts of South Sudan, even in parts of Ethiopia, in Somalia, in southern Cameroons, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There is a sense in which the majority of the African population, and Africa is a very young population, are saying we must rethink governance. They are beginning to question what one may describe as Americocentric and Eurocentric democracy, what I have referred to in other forums as the Coca-Colaization of democracy, to borrow that term from Julius Kambarage Nyerere. Democracy does not have a one-size-fits-all. And I think, without being prescriptive, that the time is now that we must ask ourselves what methods of government can we deploy which are culturally sensitive and which are capable of responding to the needs and realities of our different territories. So that even when we talk about African unity, we cannot afford naivete by thinking that what is right in Algeria is what is going to be right in Ghana. We could have an integrated Africa, but certain systems of governance will be specific and unique to the territory now called Algeria. And you go to Ghana, the Oni of Ife will still make sense, and you go to the Akan peoples, and their king will still make sense as in the Baganda. So, in a nutshell, I'm saying that the time is now for us to ask ourselves the mother question: how do we have what one may call an Afrocentric system of governance? You will note that I'm avoiding the word democracy. And my good friend from Ghana, Nana Yaa V, has written the role of culture and governance in the Ghanaian paradigm. And he examines these issues. And I hope that we will have the humility to examine these issues in the knowledge that true governance and true change is intergenerational, so that you and me cannot think that we have the monopoly of knowledge and therefore prescribe, but we can throw in our ideas, and then those ideas will be cross-fertilized and cross-pollinated by others. And lo and behold, we'll have a governance system that responds to our needs.
Finally, very briefly, PLO Lumumba, we've spoken a lot about the governance and the politics, the history and the culture. For you, though, where, if any, are the bright sparks in terms of economic development in Africa or integration?
It is not all gloom and doom. Sometimes we behave as if it is all gloom and doom. But I see useful developments. You may say the populations are small, but the Botswana are not doing very badly, even in terms of how they handle power. The Namibians, in my view, have also demonstrated that it can be done. Mauritius is not doing very badly. You can say it is too little. And I also hold the view that the Tanzanians, they may have their failings, but there is a sense in which they have done certain things right. I also think that Rwanda, given her history, and Rwanda is a country that is under attack quite a bit because of certain things, but Rwanda must be understood in the context of genocide in 1959 and genocide in 1994, and I think they have done certain things right. The Ugandans did certain things right, but there are problems now in terms of the desire to have peaceful leadership. And one can mention a few more countries, but those to me are bright points. The Ghanaians, you Ghanaians have also, in my view, been able to demonstrate that you can have a change of governance in a disciplined manner. Nigeria could do better. I've always held the view that Nigeria can do a lot better. And if you go up north, Egypt may have our own problems, but there are certain things post the Arab Spring that have happened in a reasonable manner. I hope that they will then do things a little bit better. Morocco, of course, has its own history because of the monarchy. It is also some area, there are things to be learned from Morocco. Algeria has our own problems, but I think there are certain things that are happening in Algeria that are worthy of note. I know the French have had a spat with them. Tunisia is disappointing. So I've given you what one may call a broad brush, but I hold the view that those are countries that are demonstrating, and I'm not forgetting Senegal. The change of power to the new administration, it was troubled. The Sahel is in my heart. It is in my heart because the jury is still out as to whether they'll have a proper transition. And my desire in the Sahel is that the new leaders who have come into power through extraordinary means must see themselves as midwives of a process. And I would hate to see these good men removing their military fatigues and wearing suits to contest elections. I hope they will not do it. I hope they will be midwives who will create a transition, which transition will then usher in administrations that are people anchored. That is my hope. And as I've already said, I only share my thoughts. Monopoly of wisdom is not mine. But that is designed to demonstrate that we are not all doom and gloom.
No, well, thoughts that come with more weight than most. Thank you very much, Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba, for joining us to celebrate African Union Day on the Asaase Breakfast Show.
I've seen my friend Ziad Hamoui and I've seen Douglas. I acknowledge you, and I hope you'll continue the conversation and share your thoughts as we struggle to make our continent great again. In fact, ours is a valid claim. We were great once, we must be great again, not a la Trump, but in our own unique way.
Make Africa great again. You heard it first there from PLO Lumumba. Thank you very much again for joining us on the Asaase Breakfast Show.
Thank you for watching. Like, comment, share, and subscribe.